Right now, at this very moment, more than 2 billion people around the world can recite these words without even thinking about it. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. They learned it in a whisper, in a hospital room, in a church pew, in a language they simply call English. But here is what almost nobody tells them. The man who first spoke this prayer never said a single word of it in English. He never said it in the King James English of 1611. He may never have even said it in the Greek language it was first written down in. He said it in a Jewish tongue, inside a Jewish covenant, to a Jewish God, using words that carried legal weight, agricultural weight, and centuries of memory that most translations quietly sand away. Every line of this prayer is doing double duty. On the surface, in English, it sounds soft, gentle, familiar, something you could stitch onto a pillow. Underneath, in the original Hebrew and Aramaic thought world it came from, it is sharper, stranger, and far more demanding than the English lets on. Today, we are going to walk through the Lord's Prayer cluster by cluster, phrase by phrase, and show you exactly what got lost somewhere between a hillside in Galilee and the Bible sitting on your shelf. By the time we reach the final line, you are going to hear this prayer completely differently than you have ever heard it before. Stick with me, because one cluster alone, right in the middle of this prayer, has quietly started arguments in seminaries for over 100 years. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what got buried in translation, you first have to understand who was actually praying this prayer and to whom. Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Jewish teacher teaching other Jewish people inside first-century Judea and Galilee. The prayer we now call the Lord's Prayer appears in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, right in the middle of a longer teaching known as the Sermon on the Mount. Here is the first detail that surprises most people. The oldest surviving copies of this prayer are written in Greek, because Greek was the common written language of the early Christian world. But Jesus almost certainly did not teach in Greek. His everyday spoken language was Aramaic, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, and Hebrew itself remained the language of scripture, formal prayer, and religious law. So the prayer you know today passed through at least one translation before it was ever written down at all. Aramaic and Hebrew thought filtered into Greek text and then filtered again centuries later into Latin and then again into English. Scholars have spent generations trying to reconstruct what this prayer may have sounded like in its original Semitic form, comparing it line by line against Jewish prayers that were already circulating in the synagogues of that era. What they found is striking. Almost every phrase in this prayer has a direct ancestor sitting inside older Hebrew prayer language Jesus' own listeners would have instantly recognized. This is not a story about hidden magic, secret scrolls, or supernatural revelation. This is a story about what happens very naturally when you translate a legal and covenantal document into a devotional one generation after generation, and what quietly gets left behind on the floor. It also helps to remember where this prayer sits inside the larger scene. The Sermon on the Mount is presented as a teaching moment, Jesus sitting with a crowd of fellow Jewish listeners, walking through how to live, how to treat one another, and how to pray. This prayer was handed over as a model, a short, compact template, deliberately built so ordinary people could memorize it and carry it with them. A prayer meant to be memorized and repeated by everyday people is usually built from familiar, well-worn religious vocabulary, not invented from scratch, and that is exactly what modern scholarship keeps finding. Let's start with the very first two words. The prayer opens with two English words, Our Father. In Hebrew, those two words collapse into one, Avinu, built from the root word for father, av, combined with a suffix meaning our. If you have ever sat in a synagogue during the High Holy Days, you have already heard this exact word used in a completely different, very famous setting. It is the opening word of one of the best-known prayers in all of Judaism, a prayer called Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. That pairing matters more than it seems. In the world Jesus was speaking into, calling God Father was not primarily about warmth, softness, or the gentle, comforting parent figure modern audiences often picture. It was a covenant word, a legal and relational claim with real obligations attached on both sides. In the Hebrew Bible, the entire nation of Israel is described as God's firstborn son back in the book of Exodus, when Moses is instructed to tell Pharaoh, "Israel is my son, my firstborn." Fatherhood in that world came bundled with responsibility. A father provided protection, land, inheritance, and identity. A son, in turn, owed loyalty, obedience, and the carrying forward of the family's name and covenant into the next generation. So when this prayer opens with Avinu, it is not simply offering the comfort of a nice parent somewhere in the sky. It is placing every single person praying it directly inside an ancient legal relationship, one built on mutual obligation, inheritance, and belonging to an entire people, not just a private individual arrangement between one person and God. And notice the word itself, our, not my Father. In its original setting, this prayer was never meant as a private devotion recited alone in a quiet room. It was communal from its very first syllable, assuming you're praying it alongside a whole community together, bound together by the same covenant, the same story, the same obligations. By the time this line reaches English, Our Father still technically says the same thing on paper, but the corporate, legal, covenantal weight sitting underneath those two simple words has almost entirely evaporated for the average modern reader. Most people today hear Our Father and picture something close to a greeting card. Very few people hear it and think covenant, inheritance, obligation, an entire nation bound together. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the very first line of this prayer was never meant to be private, if it was built from the ground up to be prayed by a whole covenant community together, does reciting it alone, in English, in the 21st century, change what the words are actually doing? We'll come back to that idea later, because it connects directly to something buried much deeper in this prayer, in a line about debt that almost nobody talks about from the pulpit. But first, there is a second phrase sitting right next to Our Father that we need to touch on, briefly, because we already went deep into this exact subject in another video on this channel. Hallowed be thy name. In Hebrew religious thought, the name, Hashem, was never just a polite title. It pointed toward the actual personal name of God. 4 Hebrew letters, YHWH. A name considered so sacred that by the time of Jesus, Jewish tradition had already stopped pronouncing it out loud, substituting it instead with the word Adonai, meaning my Lord. That substitution is the direct reason nearly every English Bible prints the word Lord in small capital letters throughout the Old Testament, standing in for the actual name. We already went deep into that entire story in a previous video on this channel, tracing the actual name behind Lord and what the King James translators did with it in 1611, so we won't repeat that full investigation here. What matters for today is simply this. The very first request in this prayer is not for bread or safety or forgiveness. It is a request that God's own name, God's own identity, be treated as holy above everything else, before anything else is ever asked for. And then the prayer takes a sharp turn, from a name to a kingdom. Thy kingdom come. In English, the word kingdom almost automatically triggers images most of us absorbed from fairy tales and medieval history: castles, crowns, a king seated on a throne, ruling over a fixed territory with borders drawn on a map. That is not really what the underlying Hebrew concept is doing. The Hebrew word behind kingdom is malchut, and in Jewish thought, especially in the phrase malchut shamayim, kingdom of heaven, this is not primarily a place. It is closer to an active state of rule, describing God actively reigning right now, wherever people submit to that reign, rather than a walled-off territory you could point to on a map somewhere far away. Think of the difference between a noun and a verb. English kingdom leans heavily toward the noun, a location, a realm you might travel to someday. The Hebrew concept leans much closer to the verb, kingship in action, sovereignty being exercised in the present moment. That distinction quietly changes what the prayer is actually asking for. Thy kingdom come is not primarily a request for a distant place called heaven to someday replace earth. In its original Jewish framing, it is closer to asking, let your reign, your authority, your way of ordering the world break into this world, right here, right now, the same way it already operates in heaven. This is also why the very next line, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, is not a separate thought bolted on afterward. It is essentially restating and sharpening what kingdom come already meant. Kingdom coming and will being done are two ways of saying almost the same thing, the kind of doubling Hebrew poetry loved, saying an idea once and then again in slightly different words to drive it home with weight. So here's a question worth throwing straight into the comments. If kingdom was never primarily about a location you travel to after you die, but about an active, present reign breaking into daily life right now, does that change what people are actually asking for every single time they recite this line? That one quiet shift, treating an active present reign as a distant future location, has shaped centuries of theology, sermons, and popular imagination about the afterlife. It is worth remembering, too, that the people first hearing this prayer had no illusions about earthly kingdoms. They were living under Roman occupation, taxed by a foreign empire, watched by foreign soldiers. When Jesus told them to pray for a kingdom to come, he was not handing them a vague, comforting thought about someday going to a better place. He was pointing them to an entirely different kind of authority, one measured by justice, provision, and covenant faithfulness, breaking into a world they already knew was ruled by force. And the next line takes us from the cosmic and political straight down to something as ordinary as a piece of bread, which, as you're about to see, was never quite as ordinary as it sounds. Give us this day our daily bread. This might be the most quietly mistranslated line in the entire prayer, and almost nobody notices because the English sounds so simple. Here is the strange part. The Greek word used in this line, epiousios, usually rendered as daily, is one of the rarest words in the entire Greek language. It barely appears anywhere else in surviving Greek literature outside of this exact prayer. Bible translators and Greek scholars have argued about its precise meaning for centuries. Some read it as daily, others read it as necessary for existence. The person who translated it into Latin for the Vulgate leaned toward a word closer to supersubstantial, bread that sustains a person on more than a purely physical level. In other words, the word English Bibles smooth over into the comfortable, simple daily is, in the original language, one of the single most disputed words in the entire New Testament. Now, layer in the Hebrew background sitting underneath this request. The word for bread, lechem, was never just a food item in ancient Israelite life. Bread was the base unit of survival, and it carried covenant weight far beyond nutrition. Inside the ancient Israelite tabernacle, and later the temple, there stood a table holding what was literally called the bread of the presence, lechem hapanim, bread kept continually in the presence of God as a visible sign of the ongoing covenant and provision between God and the people. Long before that, in the wilderness narrative of Exodus, the whole nation survived on manna, bread that appeared fresh every single morning, that could not be hoarded or stockpiled for tomorrow without spoiling, forcing daily, ongoing dependence rather than stored-up self-sufficiency. So when this prayer asks for daily bread, it is standing directly inside that older tradition of a people trained generation after generation to ask for exactly enough for today and to trust that tomorrow's provision would arrive tomorrow. It is a prayer against hoarding almost as much as it is a prayer for provision. In English, it reads as a gentle, almost passive request for basic needs. Underneath it, in its Hebrew and Aramaic bones, it is closer to a daily renewal of trust, an echo of manna in the wilderness, and possibly, if the ancient translators reaching for supersubstantial were onto something real, a request for more than physical survival alone. Here's a question worth sitting with before we move on. If this request was never just about calories, but about daily, renewed trust and covenant provision, what does it mean that most modern audiences hear it purely as a request for groceries? Because the next line is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, and where an entire ancient Israelite economic law gets folded quietly into 4 short English words. And forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. If you grew up in certain churches, you may have actually learned a different version of this line. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Both versions are widely used today, and that difference alone tells you something happened along the way in translation. The Gospel of Matthew's Greek text uses a word, ophelimata, that means debts, in the very literal, financial, you owe someone money sense. The Gospel of Luke's version of this same prayer uses a word closer to sins instead. Over the centuries, different English translation traditions picked different words, debts, trespasses, sins, each one trying to capture what was originally a single, heavily loaded Hebrew and Aramaic concept sitting behind all 3. In ancient Israelite law, debt was never treated as a purely private, individual financial matter, separate from the rest of society, the way it often is today. It was woven directly into the covenant structure of the whole community. The book of Deuteronomy lays out a law known as the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, occurring every 7th year, in which debts owed between fellow Israelites were to be formally released and canceled. Not postponed, not quietly renegotiated, canceled outright. The entire community was expected to periodically reset itself so that debt could never harden into a permanent underclass, generation after generation. That is the deep background sitting underneath the request, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It is not simply asking God for a private spiritual pardon, disconnected from real-world economics. It is invoking an entire social and legal system, one built around periodic communal debt release, and asking to be forgiven using that exact same logic, on the explicit condition that the person praying is willing to extend that same release to others. That conditional structure is remarkably direct in the original framing. Forgive us using the same measure we are using on the people who owe us. Ancient listeners, already familiar with Shemitah from the Torah, would have heard an economic and legal principle being applied directly to personal and spiritual life, not 2 separate, unrelated categories, the way modern thought often splits them apart. When English translation shifted toward trespasses, a word leaning more toward personal offense or moral violation, some of that financial, legal, and specifically communal weight got softened into something that reads as more private, more individual, and less about an entire society's relationship to debt, forgiveness, and economic reset. Here is a genuinely uncomfortable question worth dropping straight into the comments. If this line was originally tangled up with a real economic law about canceling actual financial debt between neighbors, not just soothing hurt feelings, does saying, "Forgive us our trespasses," let modern readers off the hook a little too easily? Because it's one thing to forgive someone for hurting your feelings. It's another thing entirely to forgive someone who genuinely owes you money and mean it the way an entire ancient legal system meant it. That tension between comfortable, private, individual forgiveness and a far more demanding communal economic version sitting inside the original language is exactly the kind of thing that quietly gets smoothed over the more a text is translated, copied, and carried across centuries and cultures. And the final line of the prayer carries us into equally uncomfortable territory, this time about the nature of evil itself, and about a closing sentence most people don't even realize was added to the prayer centuries after it was first spoken. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Greek word translated here as evil, poneru, sits in a genuinely ambiguous grammatical form. It can be read as an abstract noun, evil in general, or as a specific personal noun, the evil one. Different translation traditions have landed on different sides of that ambiguity for centuries. Some modern translations, including recent Catholic revisions, shifted specifically toward "deliver us from the evil one" to better reflect that possible original sense. In the underlying Hebrew conceptual world, the word for evil, ra, appears constantly throughout the Hebrew Bible, all the way back to Genesis, where humanity is described as gaining the knowledge of Tov and Ra, good and evil. Evil, in that framework, was rarely treated as a distant, abstract, purely philosophical category. It was understood as a real active force, capable of corrupting individuals, breaking covenants, and unraveling entire communities, which lines up naturally with reading this final line as a request for protection from an active, personal source of evil, not simply bad luck in the abstract. Now here is the detail almost nobody realizes as they recite this prayer from memory. If you grew up hearing this prayer end with, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, amen," you were reciting a line that is not actually present in the very oldest surviving Greek manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. Scholars who study ancient biblical manuscripts, a field called textual criticism, have long noted that this closing doxology is missing from the earliest and most reliable Greek copies available to us. Most modern critical translations either drop that final line entirely or print it with a footnote explaining that it was very likely added later, probably drawn from an early Christian liturgical tradition of ending prayers with a doxology, and possibly echoing a similar line found centuries earlier in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of 1 Chronicles. So the version most people around the world know by heart, word for word, including that grand closing line about the kingdom, the power, and the glory, is very likely a slightly later addition, layered on top of the prayer sometime after it was first spoken and first written down. That doesn't make the line meaningless. It has been prayed sincerely with real conviction by billions of people for close to 2,000 years. But it does mean the prayer you know is not simply an unbroken, word-for-word transmission from a hillside in Galilee straight to your bedroom wall. It passed through real historical hands, real scribes, real communities, each one shaping the text a little further along the way. So here is where all of this leaves us.
Our Father was never just a warm greeting, it was a covenant claim, spoken in the plural, assuming a whole community praying together. Hallowed be thy name pointed toward an actual, sacred, personal name for God, a name so holy it eventually stopped being spoken out loud at all. Thy kingdom come was never primarily about a distant afterlife destination. It described an active, present reign, breaking into ordinary life right now. Daily bread carried the memory of manna in the wilderness and of bread kept continually in the presence of God, a request built around trust renewed one day at a time, not stockpiled security. Forgive us our debts quietly carried an entire ancient economic law inside it, a law about canceling real debt between neighbors, not just smoothing over personal offense. And deliver us from evil closed with a line about the kingdom, the power, and the glory that almost certainly was not part of the earliest version of this prayer at all. None of this requires believing in anything supernatural to find remarkable. This is simply what happens when you trace a text backward, through Greek, through Aramaic, through Hebrew, back toward the actual world it was first spoken into. Translation, by its very nature, has to make choices. Every choice a translator makes to gain clarity in one language quietly costs something borrowed from the original. Multiply that across 2,000 years, dozens of languages, and thousands of hand-copied manuscripts, and you end up with a prayer that is still recognizably the same prayer, and yet quietly carrying a different weight than the words on the page suggest. So here is the question we want to leave you with. Out of everything we just walked through, our Father as covenant, kingdom as active reign rather than location, daily bread as manna and trust, debts as real economic law, or that closing line that may not have even been original, which one hit you the hardest? Type it in the comments below and tell us exactly which phrase is going to change the way you hear this prayer from now on. And if you want to go deeper into what actually happened to God's own name in translation, that video is linked right here, waiting for you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end.